All right. Well, welcome everybody. My thought was to my thought was to rehearse some of the major themes that we've discussed during the term, but also to try and put it in a contemporary context. That means seeing Frege as strung between Kant on the one hand and, in this case, Sellers on the other hand. I've constrained myself with great self-mastery and hardly mentioned either Hegel or Sellers in the discussion of Frege. And I still won't talk about Hegel, but I will get around to Sellers at the end today. So first big theme is the functional substitutional methodology that Frege has, that really is his, in some sense, his central technical idea. And wanted to remind you that we see what's evidently the same methodology already in Bolzano half a century before, though nobody knew about it because he couldn't publish any of the stuff. But Frege adds to that an assimilation of what you get by noting invariance under substitution to the 19th century mathematical notion of a function. And this has just been a huge idea. The whole of formal semantics would not be possible without that assimilation. Bolzano, who was a mathematician, could have made that move, but he couldn't see it. Even he couldn't see that. I sort of started the story with the lessons that Kant learned from his intense study of the proof structure of Euclid's elements. Philosophers before Kant had thought that the lesson to be drawn from Euclid's elements lay in the proofs, and that in particular they showed the coercive nature of reasons, the way reasons could compel you, so that with one of the demonstrations in Euclid, there isn't any daylight between understanding the proof and believing it, accepting the conclusion. If you don't accept that the conclusion follows from the premises, it just means you didn't understand the proof. And this was hugely significant for Plato and for people on down the line. Spinoza, doing his ethics, more geometrico, in the geometrical method, nothing about logic in there. It didn't look like logic. It looked like Euclid. But Kant's idea was that's not what's important about it. What's important about it is that Euclid is getting new stuff out of what he starts with, that his constructional method brings genuinely new things into play. We can see how from, one application of this is we can see how you could derive a conclusion that contained more than was contained in the individual premises that you'd started with. And this contrasted hugely with syllogistic logic, where, as everyone always complained, you just took out at the end in the conclusion what you'd put in the premises. The major premise already really implies the conclusion. And we saw Frege giving an account of how this works. And this I've called the Macbeth point. Not that there's only one, but it's one of the big points that she makes, that for Frege, ampliativity, the capacity to construct genuinely new conceptual contents and extract genuinely new consequences, for instance, the uniform value theorem in the calculus that he gets to in part 3 of Begriffsschrift already. In Frege, that's a matter of using the fact that different parts of an expression can play different roles. What's an argument for one function can be an argument for another function, or it can be part of a different function. And it's looking at the different roles that sub-expressions can play relative to larger expressions, typically sentences that they occur in. The fact that you can give different functional decompositions of the same expression, that's for him the key to extracting new things in a way that lets you make genuinely ampliative multi-premise inferences, where by that we mean that the conclusion contains things that are not contained in any of the individual premises. That's something that really nobody before had an account of. And Macbeth points out that this is strictly formally analogous to what goes on in Euclid, where the capacity to get new things, to get a triangle, an equilateral triangle, starting just with 2 points that you start with, where we saw, well, so you can draw a line between them, but also if you're given 2 points, you can form a circle with one as the center, the other on the circumference. We can form those 2 circles. Where they intersect, we can show that those sides are the same length as the line that we started with. So we get something new. We started off with lines and circles. We got a triangle out of it. How did that happen? Well, the line segment can play different roles. It can just be a line segment, or it can be a segment that's connecting the center of one circle with a point on its periphery, or it can be, we can flip which is the center and which is the periphery from it. The fact that the same figure can be a line segment, a radius of a circle, and the side of a triangle. It's moving between those different roles in larger wholes that some figure is playing. That's where the ampliativity is coming from in Euclid. And that's exactly what we get, the different roles that something can play in different functions as arguments of different functions, as now the value of a function, now the argument, now part of a function. If you think about decomposing an expression like 2 to the 4th, or even the expression 2 to the 4th equals 16, into functions and arguments in different ways. Really, the ampliativity at base, that's where it's coming. That's where it's coming from. And Kant saw that in Euclid. We saw that something special happens in the Fregean context if you move from monadic properties to polyadic properties or relations. If you decompose functionally, you get what Dummett calls complex predicates rather than just simple predicates. Those predicates where the relations among the different arguments, which arguments occur more than once in the function, for instance, matters for the identity of a complex function, of a complex predicate that we need to think about to understand the relation between X admiring Y, being an admirer, and being a self-admirer, X admiring X. But we saw the Hinticke-Friedman point that if you move beyond these polyadic complex predicates and look at the relations you get if you alternate quantifiers, paradigmatically, if you have a for all there is, then you get genuinely new stuff. And Kant saw this fact, not in those terms. he saw that where the action was in Euclid was saying that between any 2 points there is. So for any 2 points, there is a midpoint of the segment. Again, we can construct that with circles and get a perpendicular joining them to bisect it. But for every 2 points, there is a midpoint, which already is giving you not just the existence of something you didn't start with, the midpoint, you started with the endpoints, but it's giving you an infinity of points along the line. And Kant saw that making existential claims and making claims about infinity were coming from the same place. It was the same sort of function. And Hinteke, and following him, Friedman saw first that was putting a universal quantifier in front of an existential one for all there is. Those alternating quantifiers is what's giving you, for every pair of points there is a midpoint. For every pair there is an equilateral triangle that has that segment as a base, and that Kant had said, okay, there has to be a way of putting the premises together in an essentially multi-premise inference. There has to be a special way of putting them together such that you can get more out than if you just sort of listed them or plunked them down. And he called that synthesizing them, and thought of that on the Euclidean model. And Hinteke and Friedman saw that those alternating quantifiers formally are equivalent to Skolem functions, where Skolem showed you could get the effect of arbitrary iterated alternating quantifiers, that is, of all of them, since we can squash all the consecutive universals into one that applies to a tuple, and similarly for the existential. So you could do quantificational logic if, instead of having quantifiers, you had Skolem functions, which wherever there's an alternating quantifier for all there is, you just have a function that takes as its argument anything and gives you a value, the value being the one that there is. So a Skolem function that, given any 2 points, will return as its value, taking that as the argument, will return as its value the midpoint of them. And they used that as a model for Kantian synthesis. Now, there's a kind of pragmatism involved here. Already there is in Euclid. So everybody who read Euclid saw that there was a difference between what was going on, the reasoning that was going on in the diagrams, where you actually constructed the midpoint, the equilateral triangle, and so on, than what was going on in the discursive argumentation, which was not syllogistic, but it was inferential. It had premises and conclusions. But Euclid really starts with 2 primitive abilities. The ability to draw a line between any 2 points, and the ability to draw a circle, given any 2 points, a circle that has one of them as the center and the other is determining the radius. Those 2 primitive abilities correspond to the ability to use a straight edge to connect any 2 points and draw the line defined by those 2 points, and a compass to draw a circle, taking any one of them as a center, and shows that how you can systematically elaborate those primitive abilities into the ability to find the midpoint, to construct an equilateral triangle, and so on. Later to do all sorts of things with the angles, with angles, which is a new item. You just started off with pairs of points. That was all you had. And we, looking back, can see that some of the construction methods early on in Euclid's Elements correspond to elaborating those primitive abilities by straight schedule algorithms. Straight schedule algorithm just corresponds to a list of things to do. Do this, then do this, then do this. So, for instance, in Proposition 1 of Book 1, there's just a list of things you do to construct the equilateral triangle that has as its base the line segment determined by 2 points. But later on, we get more complicated things that correspond to conditional branch schedule algorithms. Those are straight schedule algorithms where you make a decision at some point conditionally on what you get. Do these circles intersect at 2 points, at 0 points, or at 1 point? We've already showed those are all the alternatives, but you do different things in the construction depending on which one you get. That's a conditional branch schedule algorithm. That's enough to get everything computationally. That's what a von Neumann architecture does. The Euclidean computation is a kind of computational pragmatics of geometry. It consists of these primitive abilities and the capacities that you can elaborate from them by deploying these primitive abilities according to conditional branch schedule algorithms. And Kant, following his lesson, the lesson about synthesis that he derived from or learned from his study of Euclid, also has as an essential part of his semantics a corresponding pragmatics, an account of what you need to be doing, how you need to be putting things together so that you can then later on take them apart analytically in various ways. Kant gives a certain priority to this pragmatic side of things. He understands contents, judgeable contents, and so the concepts that are rules for manipulating those, or forming those judgeable contents in terms of the synthetic activity of putting them all together in a rational whole, a unity that has the rational structure characteristic of apperception. You need to think about what you need to do in order to combine your judgments into a whole like this, into a whole that has a rational systematic unity where each of the claims in it, you've included in the whole what follows from it. You've excluded things that are incompatible with it. For the things in there, you can give reasons from other claims that are in it. And he wants to read off the semantic notion of content from this pragmatics of what you're doing with the contents. And I think this is the dimension of Kant that the American pragmatists take and run with. This notion that you ought to understand the contents of our thoughts and claimings in terms of what you need to do in order to be thinking that, claiming that, inferentially and so on. I think of American pragmatism as just the American neo-Kantianism. Austrian neo-Kantianism is Carnap and the Vienna Circle, and German neo-Kantianism, really quite different, picks up a different strand in Kant than this pragmatic one. What ties together the two main groups, the Southwest neo-Kantians, Windelband and Rickert, and the Marburg neo-Kantians, Cohen and Nator. What ties them all together is Kant's insight into the normativity of intentionality. They focused on the normativity because that uh, gave a space for people to do philosophy that wasn't merely natural science or, God help us, theology. But the rise of modern science, laboratory science in 19th century Germany threatened to leave no space for people to do philosophy, just do psychology or do sociology or political theory, thought of as social sciences rather than philosophy. They said, no, we learned from Kant normativity. It's the bindingness of these things. And philosophers are, above all, students of the normativity, and you won't find that in the laboratories. So they picked up on the normative strain rather than the pragmatic strain in Kant, I want to say. Frege is Kantian in looking to features of representings to understand features of the representeds. And so looking at the activity of representing in order to understand what's represented. Paradigmatically, in the Grundlagen, he very quickly transforms the question, are numbers objects, into the form in which he can actually address it, which is, do we use numerals as proper singular terms? If we do, and those numerals occur essentially in some true claims, then that's what it is for there to be numbers, for those represented objects to exist. That's a huge transformation. Dummett says that's where analytic philosophy began. That's where philosophy of language began, with the idea that if you understand how to properly use expressions as singular terms, that has to contain everything there is to know about what it is for there to be objects that you're talking about. Now, I think this Kantianism comes out in Frege. So where I'm going with this, if you look ahead in the outline, one of the other themes I want to mention is Frege's introduction of the world of senses as this third world that is neither neither merely subjective nor objective in the way that dogs and stones and stars are. Well, what he's dividing up is really the realm of Bedeutungen. What there is for him is what can, in principle, be referred to. All the elements of all three of the realms of being of Frege can be referred to by expressions. Even the senses can. The senses are the Bedeutungen of indirect discourse, talk about what people believe and mean, and so on. So in taking the realm of Bedeutungen to coincide with reality, Frege is adopting this Kantian order of explanation. But I think we can push Frege's Kantianism even a little bit harder. I think if you ask most Frege scholars, well, Frege has a lot to say about logic, and though it wasn't a word he was using, it's a word we owe to Peirce in this use. He taught us a lot about semantics, about the theory of the content of things. But if we ask about his pragmatics, let's say, well, he worries about assertion, but he doesn't say very much about assertion. Force contrasts with content. We have this distinction that the Frege-Geach argument enforces, but he really says very little about assertion. We've said his pragmatics is vestigial. And you might think that in contemporary philosophy of language, the pragmatics is still pretty much vestigial, the tail rather than the dog of philosophy of language. Well, that's to say we pragmatists are maybe not at the center of the discipline as it's practiced. But I wanted to at least try to make a case that Frege has a more robust pragmatics than is obvious to begin with. He ends up with an account of judging and its linguistic expression, assertion. What are you doing in judging? You're expressing your recognition of a sentence, an expression, as true. In Grundgesetze terms, as a name of the true. This picture, when you discover something, the sun has come out from behind the cloud, and you say that, you're, in his image, recognizing the sun has come out as a name of your old friend, the true. I didn't know that this was a name, and now I do. I recognize, this familiar feeling. It's like seeing a face out of a crowd. It's, that's so-and-so, that change. That's what judging is acknowledging something as a name of your old friend, the true. But it's expressing the recognition of something of an expression as the name of the true. And in the Grundlagen, he told us what recognition statements are. They're identity claims, an identity sign flanked by two singular terms, and which expresses the recognition of an object as the same again when picked out in the two ways corresponding to the two terms. Canonical representation of a judgment has the canonical name of the true on one side, the one where you can't be confused about whether it's a name of the true. It's the canonical name. But any recognition statement, any identity claim, is the recognition of an object as the same again, picked out in these two ways. And the inferential role of identity claims is completely determined by their functioning as intersubstitution licenses, salva veritate. So he has an account of what you're doing in judging that tells us about the norms it sets for inferences, what you're committing yourself to as to the goodness of inferences by endorsing this identity. And he has an account of what you have to do to grasp a sense, to grasp, in the first instance, a thought, the sense of a declarative sentence. Well, it's knowing your way around its inferential role, in the sense already of Section 3 of the 79 Begriffsschrift, where two things have the same begriffliche Inhalt, conceptual content, if when combined with other premises into a multi-premise inference, they have the same consequences. Well, being able to tell what the consequences of a claim are when it's combined with certain other claims, that's what grasping a sense is. And you grasp the sense better insofar as you're better at telling which of those inferences are good and which ones of them are bad. And that practical ability to know how to distinguish good from bad implications and incompatibilities involving the claim, Frege breaks down further into the capacity to do functional decompositions of the expressions, to associate the sense with them in, on the computational model, a set of functions applied to arguments each of which is a computation of the common Bedeutung of them. It's the substitutions according to this functional decomposition that preserve truth that are the good ones. So in general, what you need to do to grasp a sentential sense is to determine its inferential role by computing its Bedeutung from the sense, from the functional decompositions of the expression. And in the Grundgesetze, all the inferences are in the end licensed by identity claims construed as intersubstitution licenses. So Frege actually has a fairly rich account of what it is you have to do in order to be grasping a sense, recognizing a Bedeutung from it, which is picking up that this is this is a crucial dimension of his being a Kantian. Now I want to look back a little bit at Bolzano, because it can look as though Bolzano is streets ahead of Frege in thinking about these things. Not that he cared about the pragmatics. He didn't. But in applying this substitutional methodology, which Frege further advances by thinking of in terms of functions or generalizing the notion of function to include it, but the methodology assimilating expressions accordingly as they're intersubstitutable, saving something, as noting invariance under substitution, Bolzano takes that idea and in several ways takes it farther than Frege does. So one is that he does that for whole arguments. Frege never looks at functional decompositions of anything larger than a sentence. But Bolzano looks at implication relations that have a bunch of premises and a conclusion, and incompatibility relations that we can also think of as a bunch of premises that are jointly incompatible with some conclusion, even though they're not severally incompatible with it. In each case, we're looking at something, the conclusion that's either implied by or incompatible with the premises and need not be implied by or incompatible with any of them individually. It's the collection of them, this mystery, how can there be more when you put them together, that led Kant to think, well, there must be a special way of putting them together. And Bolzano says, look, we can use this substitutional methodology to say what the good implications and incompatibilities are in general. And Frege never does anything like that. Frege doesn't have a general notion of consequence. He has a notion of logical consequence that he gives us an account of. But Bolzano's definition is not going to require distinguishing the logical bits from the other bits. He says, if there is any partition of the whole vocabulary into fixed and variable, such that every variation of the variable parts, substituting variable for variable parts in the premises, that makes the premises true, also makes the conclusion true, then it's a good implication. And if it makes the conclusion false, then it's an incompatibility. That is, if every variation of the premises that makes them true leads to a variant of the conclusion that is true, the implication is true, or if every one of them leads to one that's false, then it's an incompatibility. And that applies no matter what the division of fixed into fixed and variable vocabulary is. The only reason picking the logical vocabulary as the fixed vocabulary is special for Bolzano is that it's easier to tell with logical vocabulary what the good implications are. Even though he doesn't give us an algorithm for doing that. But still, he can tell us about conjunction and about conditionals and negation and so on in those terms, in a way that's very difficult if what you're holding fixed is the nautical vocabulary or the culinary vocabulary, as opposed to the logical vocabulary. But again, it looks like he's doing something, much more general. I mean, he is doing something much more general than what Frege did. For Bolzano, as it were, semantically, all the divisions of the vocabulary into fixed and variable are on a par. They all generate some set of good implications and good incompatibilities, all of which genuinely hold for the expressions involved. And any considerations for preferring one division to another are going to be heuristic, epistemological rather than semantic in a general sense. As I say, the 4-volume Wissenschaftslehre of Bolzano, the last 2 volumes are this sort of epistemological cum heuristic considerations about in what circumstances is one way of dividing the vocabulary more useful than another. But now I want to say, it's misleading, really, to see what Bolzano is doing as simply generalizing what Frege has, as though, Frege did it for logical vocabulary, but Bolzano did it for everything. First of all, obviously, Frege gave us a way of computing what the good implications and incompatibilities are if you hold the logical vocabulary fixed. You can just compute what those are. And Bolzano didn't do that for any vocabulary. But the other idea that Bolzano never had that is absolutely central to Frege is the idea of what the distinctive expressive job that distinguishes logical vocabulary from other vocabulary is. And already at the beginning in the Begriffsschrift, he says, look, I'm introducing these logical locutions in order to make conceptual contents explicit, in order to be able to codify relations of implication and incompatibility that determine what the content of these expressions is. Frege was a logical expressivist, the first one, who says what's distinctive about logical vocabulary is it has the expressive job of making reason relations explicit, making inferential relations explicit, specifically relations of implication and incompatibility. And he shows that whatever good implications and good incompatibilities you get by fixing theological or geological vocabulary rather than logical vocabulary, whatever ones you determine by the method of noting invariance under substitution Bolzano-wise, whatever good implications or incompatibilities you have can be made explicit by logical vocabulary. Now that's very different from thinking that underneath all of those geologically good arguments, say, if it's a metamorphic rock, then it was formed from igneous rocks by some process. That I think is a geologically good implication, but pretend it is anyway. But you can use Frege's conditionals to say that it is, to say what follows from what. So there's a sense in which what Frege did is universal, encompassing, everything that Bolzano did. He gave us the expressive resources to make explicit all of these senses of good implication that Bolzano can distinguish. And he did that using the sort of apparatus of functional decomposition, recognition of the true, intersubstitution licenses, and so on. So Frege used that apparatus in a way that never occurred to Bolzano to do this remarkable, detailed thing. Nonetheless, I think the Fregean achievement is more resonant in the context of the definitions of implication and incompatibility that Bolzano got by applying the substitutional methodology to units that are larger than the sentence, to implications and incompatibilities. And as I say, Frege's extension of the mathematical notion of a function to apply wherever the substitutional methodology does, that paid all sorts of benefits as well. Okay. Moving to the second item on the outline, the next sort of big topic is abstraction. And it's connected to that first one because abstraction is a way of forming objects from concepts, or singular terms from sentences, if we like. And this is another gigantic advance that Frege makes in the Grundlagen now, to say what abstraction is. And again, abstraction was a really important concept in early modern philosophy, maybe loomed larger with the empiricists than it did with the rationalists, but both of them cared about it a lot. None of them understood what it was in the way that Frege explained to us. That it is a way of introducing new sortal kind terms and singular terms governed by them. So introducing a new vocabulary, a new set of terms, and giving us semantic access to potentially a new set of objects from the use of an old vocabulary, by taking an equivalence relation formulated in the old vocabulary, an equivalence relation that is reflexive, symmetric, and transitive. That's what it means for it to be an equivalence relation in the old vocabulary, and turning it into or taking it as an identity governing the expressions in the new vocabulary. And his example of moving from your being able to, in Euclid, talk about parallel lines. Being parallel to is an equivalence relation. And if you treat it as an identity, you've introduced a new kind of thing, directions of lines, which can be identical or non-identical, entirely determined by the facts in the base vocabulary, the more concrete vocabulary relative to this move. And this really cleaned up the discussion of abstraction. You want to go back to people like Hume and reread what he had to say about abstraction as a way of moving from immediate impressions to ideas, given this much more definite conception of what abstraction is. And it's the basis of Frege's semantics because noting invariance under substitution is an equivalence relation. To be intersubstitutable salva veritate or salva consequentiae defines an equivalence relation among the expressions being intersubstitutable without changing the truth value or the goodness of implications to notions that correspond to the hierarchy of Bedeutung and of senses, respectively. That gives you an equivalence relation, and his application of that substitutional methodology in the semantic realm, which is not, directions of lines ain't in it because there isn't substitution. That's not where we got the equivalence relation. But he looks all and only at equivalence relations that are intersubstitution saving something, preserving some property, in order to do semantic abstraction. Yeah.
This is more about curiosity. Do you know the idea of abstractions as a group in classes, right? Since very algebraic, was any of that machinery already available?
Among the mathematicians?
Yeah.
I don't think so.
Right.
I mean, they did it, but they didn't, have a name for this methodology, didn't distinguish things in this way. So, for instance, when Dedekind defines rational numbers by Dedekind cuts in a sequence, that is by abstraction. You're saying when two rational numbers, when two real numbers are the same in terms of features of the rational numbers, in terms of an equivalence relation, you define that. But he doesn't say this is abstraction and notice it's the same thing that's going on with these other things. It was a pervasive practice, but people didn't understand it as, hadn't made the philosophical move. I've recited before Seller's slogan that grasp of a concept is always mastery of the use of a word. They were doing this, but they didn't have a term that assimilated these moves under the heading of abstraction. And the jump from that to thinking of what's going on when Hume is worrying about how we could get the idea of a triangle, given that every sensuous instance of it that we see is, either equilateral or isosceles or scalene, but we get the idea of the triangle, which is not. I think Dedekind would not instantly have seen that as doing the same thing that he was doing. That's a philosophical move to introduce that. The way mathematics was going, somebody was going to get in the vicinity, but I think that, anybody who does intellectual history knows that making a claim, no, this was the first time this was done, is just red meat for the people to go out and find somebody, some precursor who did it. So should be cautious about that, but I actually think so. So this is the way Frege gets all of his technical terms. It's by applying this substitutional methodology and then abstracting, using it for abstraction, with the equivalence relation being intersubstitutability, either salva veritate or salva consequentiae. That's his overall methodology, which means that all of his technical concepts are introduced by abstraction. So conceptual content, Inhalt, he tells us two expressions have the same conceptual content in case substituting one as a premise in a set of premises never changes the consequences that you get. And now he treats that as an equivalence relation, turns it into an identity to get the notion of conceptual content. That's how we get the notion of Bedeutung. That's intersubstitutability saving truth values. We get the notion of truth value that way. The truth values are the objects corresponding to being true or being false, which we assimilate all the sentences that are either all true or all false. That's equivalence relations, and the objects we get are the truth values. The senses are intersubstitutable salva consequentiae. Courses of values are introduced as two functions having the same course of values in case for the same arguments they give you the same conclusions. All of these are introduced by abstraction. And Frege is careful when he introduces the notion of abstraction to talk about it as a method of introducing sortal-kind terms and singular terms that fall under them, directions, and the singular term direction of the Earth's axis, rather than talking about them as a way of introducing a kind of thing, because, or anyway, he needs to make that distinction, because he wants to say, well, Bedeutungen are introduced by abstraction. Two things have the same Bedeutung in case substituting one for the other never changes the truth value of the expression. But the Bedeutung of the expression Fido is Fido, the dog. And the dog is not any kind of an abstract object. So we can introduce this notion of Bedeutungen by abstraction, but it's going to turn out that what we introduced is just objects we already knew about. Or anyway, some of them are. I mentioned that making the inference from how we know something to the kind of thing it is, that's the Platonic principle. Right? Starting off, well, there are things we know by sensibility. They're in the sensuous realm of becoming, and then there are the things we know by intellect. They're in the intelligible realm of being. Well, there's a semantic version of that Platonic principle, which would try and read off features of the kinds of things there are off of the way we introduce expressions referring to them. And Frege is rejecting that. He says the way in which a singular term has been introduced is not a property of objects, that has to do with our capacity to talk about them and think about them, not with the kind of thing that they are. There's a progression in the Grundlagen. His second definition of number is by abstraction from concepts whose extensions can be put in one-to-one correspondence. But he moves on to a third definition. He says this one won't do because to introduce a singular term, you need to settle the truth values of all the identities involving it. Your stipulation must settle that, even if it's not in our ability to apply that and instantly determine all the truth values. We don't know. You get new knowledge, recognizing the same object in an unfamiliar guise. But he's very clear there that the method of abstraction only settles the homogeneous identities, identities both sides of which are introduced by abstraction, indeed by abstraction using the same equivalence relation as the abstractor. So we can tell whether the direction of the Earth's axis is the same as, I don't know, the direction of the spinning top, but we can't tell whether the direction of the Earth's axis it's not settled whether the direction of the Earth's axis is Julius Caesar or England. And this leads him to give up that sort of Humean definition, the second definition, which, given all the troubles that his later things ran into, is the one that Bob Hale and Crispin Wright revert to say, look, there is a consistent and satisfactory definition of number possible, but we should use his second definition, not move to the third one. But the third one is trying to solve a problem with abstraction by abstraction, and says the number associated with a concept, the number associated with the concept moons of Jupiter, for instance, is what we get by abstraction using the equivalence relation among concepts of being equinumerous, where we understand that as you can put them in one-to-one correspondence. You can put the extensions of the concepts into a one-to-one correspondence. And then we have the notorious footnote. I assume it's known what an extension is. You'll say, you were so fierce on everybody else and their definitions, and you just do this. But 5 years later, in Function and Object, he solves this by introducing extensions as courses of values of concepts. And courses of values are introduced by abstraction. Two functions have the same course of values if, for every argument, they have the same value. Concepts are functions whose values are truth values. Extensions are the course of values of concepts. And that's the notion. So course of values defined by abstraction. That's the notion he takes into Grundgesetze and gets into trouble. As Russell points out to him, some of those courses of values are inconsistent. There's a course of values that corresponds to the set of all sets that are not members of themselves, a concept that applies to concepts that don't apply to their own extension, is the way it's going to come up, that are not true of their own extension. This method of introducing new objects by abstraction, in this semantic context, it's too powerful. It lets you say things that you don't want to say. Before you introduce these objects, it isn't a problem that the concept set that is not a member of itself or the Fregean equivalent are inconsistent. There's not a problem with inconsistent concepts. If you can show that it's inconsistent, then you know that it doesn't apply to anything. But that's a good inference to make from it. We use these concepts in indirect proofs by contradiction. We can handle inconsistent concepts. The problem is when by abstraction you use them to introduce objects. Inconsistent objects are ones that have inconsistent properties. And that blows up the system. If your method of introducing objects can introduce inconsistent objects, then the system blows up inferentially. So this step from concepts to objects in the semantic case, from concepts to objects, that is the semantic case. Leads to the disaster of Frege's life, but of the Grundgesetze. So something needs to be done about that. Where does this go wrong? And we already have notions. We already have procedures for defining concepts from objects. Substitution is a way of doing that. We look at what's true of everything such that if you substitute it in this object, you save this property. And it's the interaction of that functional method of decomposition and this abstractive method of forming objects from concepts. The machinery is too powerful and sort of shakes itself apart when we turn the machine on. So what to do? I talked a little while ago about Frege's attempt to get to settle the truth of all the identities, including the heterogeneous identities, in section 10, discussing axiom 5 and the long footnote there, and argued that it isn't successful. I wanted to register here, though we can't go into all the details, that a response to all of this would be to relax the criterion of adequacy of introducing a singular term that requires that all the identities relating it to any of the other singular terms that are in your system have been settled. If you can relax that requirement, Frege wanted to stipulate that all the heterogeneous identities in Grundgesetze are false. That was what he was trying to do in that in section 10. Whereas really the attitude should be, we just don't care what the truth values of those identities is. It doesn't matter as long as we can keep track of, we know some inferences are good, and we can tell whether our inferences turn on these other identities having a truth value or not. The ultimate reason for the requirement that you settle the truth values of all the identities is so it can be settled which inferences are good and which aren't, so we can have determinate conceptual contents. But we can have a determinately good set of inferences and another determinately bad set of inferences, and a don't know, don't care area in between, as long as we can tell the difference between those. As long as we can tell that our good inferences never turned on introducing an object that we haven't settled the identities of. It doesn't matter if nothing that we inferentially care about turns on the truth of those identities. And in an essay I put in the reading some weeks ago of mine called The Significance of Complex Numbers for Frege's Philosophy of Mathematics, I argue that his program in the Grundgesetze never fulfilled. He wanted to start off with the natural numbers, build the integers out of that, build the rationals out of that, build the reals out of that, and the complex numbers out of that. He was supposed to do all of that. He aimed to do all of that in the Grundgesetze. It blew up already with the natural numbers, and so all we get is a sketch, what he'd already done in the way of real numbers. But he didn't get all the way there. Peter Simon has studied that and sort of figured out how it was going to go. But what I argue is that there is, mathematically, we can show that there isn't a way of satisfying his criterion for extending the real numbers to the complex numbers because of the duality of the complex plane. There's not going to be a way of settling the identities that turn on which square root of -1 it is that we tack the name I onto. If you ask the mathematician, they'd say, well, it doesn't matter, pick one. Yeah, but there isn't enough structure in the real numbers to pick one. How do you pick one of them and not the other? Which one did you get? There simply isn't a way of doing that because of the duality. I mean, a lot more needs to be filled in to make that argument, but the symmetry of the complex plane that you can substitute I for -I everywhere, and as long as you do it systematically, you won't change the goodness of any inferences or the truth of any claims, even though you can't retail substitute one for the other. They are different numbers in the complex environment. But if you systematically substitute them, nothing changes. And this is a ubiquitous phenomenon in the algebra, the group theory that was sort of growing up around the time Frege was writing. So on fundamental grounds, you cannot settle the truth of all the new identities based on the relations of the old things, at least not if you're building up in mathematics. And this is not some pitiable defect on the part of the complex plane. It's as well behaved a mathematical object as there is. That, in that essay, I argue, shows that you need not settle the truth of all the identities in order to have properly behaved singular terms. Or if you want to pound on the table and say, no, by singular term, I mean, this is Frege's Eigenname, I mean something that is only properly introduced by settling all the terms, then fine, we can introduce schmingular terms where you don't have to settle all the identities, as long as you can keep inferential control over them, which is what it means to say that the complex plane is a well-behaved object. We can tell what follows and what doesn't follow, even though there isn't an answer to the question which square root of -1 do we assign the numeral I to, and which do we assign -I to. There isn't any answer that you can specify in the language of real number theory to that question. So there's a fallback position available to Frege that he never saw as an option. What we get in the late teens is him saying, well, maybe we need to start with geometry instead of with logic in order to get numbers. So he starts with the complex plane there, but we just have fragments from there. Okay, so that's, as it were, extracting a consequence from putting together the substitutional methodology and the particular application of it that is abstraction. Those two big ideas of his. Third one I wanted to put on the table is Frege's innovative three-world ontology, where people had distinguished subjective things, Cartesian things, from objective, actual things. His term is wirklich, from the German werken, to work, things that make a difference, that can cause changes and be caused by them. objective things independent of the subjective ideas that we have of them. And Frege says, yeah, but there's a third realm of things that are objective but not actual, not wirklich. And numbers are a paradigm of those things, but senses are a paradigm as well. And here, I guess I wanted to point out a few things. All of Frege's concepts are introduced by abstraction, and we can ask about them, well, which realm do they go in? He doesn't tell us, but presumably he thinks, does he? What about the direction of the Earth's axis? Is that objective but not wirklich? Or is it objective and wirklich? We sort of ask about that before we get to the fancy semantic terms that are introduced by abstraction, that is, by where the abstractor, the equivalence relation, is a substitutional relation. That's how we get, anyway, if it's substitutional, saving a semantic property like truth or goodness of implications, then we introduce semantic vocabulary that way. But the notion of abstraction is much broader. The paradigm of unwirklich, I think, episodes are Cambridge properties and Cambridge changes. I think this is named after McTaggart, but it was by somebody making fun of McTaggart who called them this, but that's what they have come to be called. So a Cambridge property is my having the same eye color as the oldest living inhabitant of Provo, Utah. Right? Now, if the oldest one dies while we're talking, and they have a different eye color than the one who inherits that mantle, then I lost that property. I had it when we walked into the seminar, and I don't have it now. That's a Cambridge change, because those are Cambridge properties. And the question is, could that have caused something? Is that a difference that could make a difference in James's phrase? We say, well, maybe not independently of people's attitudes towards it. I mean, if we'd had a bet on whether, when I leave the seminar room, whether I would still have this property or not, and I've, bet all my money on it, then I could be, lose that bet and become impoverished. That would be an effect, but only because we have attitudes towards these properties. Are they efficacious otherwise? You might want to say, well, those are not actual, they're not wirklich properties. In Frege speak, a property is just a one-place concept, just a monadic concept, because a concept is a mapping of objects onto truth values, and this is just like a mathematician would call it a characteristic function, using the extended notion of function that Frege introduced, that assigns true to all the things that have the property and false to all the things that don't. If you take polyadic predicates, then you get polyadic concepts, then you get relations instead of properties, Cambridge properties, Cambridge concepts, those are genuine properties, but are they causally efficacious? Well, is the direction of the Earth's axis, is that capable of causing things or responding? Well, yes, it actually has changed. It wobbled, when the big piece of the moon was knocked off of it quite a while ago. Things like the center of mass, which is like the direction of Earth's axis, these things can be invoked in causal explanations of things. These are the very things that idealizations that Nancy Cartwright has in mind in her aptly named book, How the Laws of Physics Lie. She says physics just talks about these idealizations. And we pretend that they're talking about real things. So this is to say that there's issues about distinguishing among objective things between the wirklich ones and the unwirklich ones. Numbers, he thinks, is a paradigm of the thing that isn't wirklich. And you might think that any time you invoke one of these more abstract features, like the direction of the Earth's axis, that there must be something more concrete, some story that only appeals to more concrete things that could explain at least the particular event, the wobbling of the direction of the Earth's axis, some kind of supervenience claim about it. I just wanted to indicate that Frege treats these as three different kinds of Bedeutungen, three different kinds of things. But it's not perfectly clear how the boundaries around them are drawn. Okay, he's not going to have a theory about the subjective ones. That's not his department. Is it by incorrigibility, privacy? What do you say about those? But for these others, there are real sort of ontological questions. Another such question is, well, where do these realms have functions as well as objects in them? In some sense, it's clear for him that they do. As I say, Fregean concepts, which are Bedeutungen, not Sinne, they are functions from anything but, let's say, objects to truth values. They're properties that things can have. And if this thing has the property of being copper, it follows that it conducts electricity. There have to be concepts in the wirklich world. He's a conceptual realist. The world comes conceptually structured. The actual world is conceptually structured. Now there's also the realm of senses, and there are going to be functions in that world as well. One of the puzzles that Dummett raises for Frege, and there's a non-trivial literature on this question, is about sense functions. There's two sort of principles that govern the senses. So senses contain modes of presentation of Bedeutungen. And now we have in the realm of wirklich Bedeutungen functions that take us from one object to another object. What are the senses of those function expressions? They could be the senses of the functions that take us from an object to an object. So we have the sense of the capital of function, which takes us from Sweden to Stockholm. And we have the sense of that. But we also have the sense of Sweden and the sense of Stockholm and a function that takes us from the one sense to the other sense. That's a function between senses rather than the sense of a function from the arguments to the values. Frege seems committed to saying both things about the senses of, but the sense of capital of, that it's the sense of a function that takes you from inter alia Stockholm to Sweden to Stockholm, but also that it is a function from the sense of the term Sweden to the sense of the term Stockholm. That would be a sense function entirely in the realm of senses. So would the other one, but it seems like they're different things. That's a Demetian conundrum, and as I say, there's a non-trivial literature about whether and if so, how that could be resolved. Okay, so Bolzano also postulated this third realm, which is where propositions lived. Insofar as Frege has a notion of proposition, it's the notion of a thought, and that's the sense of a declarative sentence. The Bedeutung that corresponds to that is always a truth value, but a fact, he says, is a thought that is true. Any thought that has the true as its Bedeutung is a fact, but that's in the third world. That's a kind of sense. Facts are not actual, and so can't do anything apart from the effects of their being grasped by us, by subjects. And so we need to bring the third world in if that's where graspings of senses are, then sort of all of them are involved there. So I don't have a particular claim to make about this three-world view. It is striking that the two practitioners of the method of noting invariance under substitution both found themselves obliged to postulate a world of objective but non-actual things to be in order to make sense of this. So I want to use this discussion of Frege's third world and sort of the way he draws this line to contrast with another ontological distinction that Sellers makes. He has a two-sorted ontology, and I think there's interesting connections between these. But we can do that after the break. Let's take 15 minutes. It's 2:26, so let's come back at 2:41. I don't know the Kassir review, and I'd be interested to...
Sellers review of book of Kassir.
Right, I don't know the Sellers review of Kassira that you're talking about would be interested. But the biggest event in Sellers' early intellectual life was what turned him to what he called the new way of words, to sort of language first philosophy, which was very much identified with Carnap. Do things in the formal mode, not in the material mode. And people like Sellers' father, Roy Wood, thought this was just terrible for essentially the same reasons that Tim Williamson would give now. We care about how things really are, not just about the linguistic reflection of them. You're just going to get misled insofar as that isn't just a way of finding out how things are. Any difference is going to be to the bad. But Sellers read Carnap on abstract objects, and Carnap gave a metalinguistic account of them, and the scales fell from Sellers' eyes, and he saw that the metalinguistic structures that Carnap was talking about were a version of Kantian categories. That when you were the big Kantian invention, really, discovery, the distinction between ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary, including the theoretical vocabulary of sciences, that's in the business of describing and explaining, the antics of actual things, is just one kind of concept. And that there's another kind whose expressive job is not to describe and explain those things, but to make explicit, to articulate the framework within which description and explanation is possible. And that was a really central move of Kant's, and that Carnap had laboriously rediscovered this other class of concepts, the categorical concepts, the pure concepts of the understanding, but understood them as metalinguistic concepts in a language for talking about talking. And suddenly he could see, yes, this is right, to see the talk about talk as the locus of these concepts. And so he saw what Carnap himself never saw, that Carnap was a neo-Kantian, that although Carnap's official view about Kant was that he was a bad old metaphysician, we'd gotten beyond that, that in fact Carnap was just a distinctive metalinguistic kind of neo-Kantian. And he lamented that he discovered that too late to explain it to Carnap. Carnap was too old by then, and probably wouldn't have liked it. But Sellers had a very keen eye for people who were Kantian without realizing it. And this identification with Carnap, that was recognizing him as a fellow neo-Kantian. Was that a responsive answer? Yeah, okay. Well, as I said, I wanted to put in place, begin to sketch some Sellarsian context for some of Frege's views, in particular the three-world view, the introduction of the third world, the objective but non-actual things, and then a sort of Frege's revenge, using one of Frege's central distinctions to sharpen up and illuminate the Sellarsian one. So Sellers has a two-world ontology. He talks about the world in the narrow sense and the world in the broad sense. And the world in the broad sense is everything. That was what Quine said was your answer to the ontological question, what is there? The beginning answer has to be everything. Everything's in the world in the broad sense. The world in the narrow sense is the world as it would be, as it could be, if there had never been discursive practitioners in it. The non-discursive world. So the way the world, suppose we're the only talkers, the way the world was before there were any talkers, and the way the world would have been if there had never gotten to be any talkers. And there's some things, there wouldn't be prices of things in the world in the narrow sense. There can be prices of things in the world in the broad sense. Anything that's the product of our discursive activity is only in the world in the broad sense, not in the narrow sense. And I think this is an important distinction, and I think it's one that can be made sharp anyway. It's a counterfactual. Issue. But when Sellers reads Carnap on abstract objects, in particular addressing the problem of universals, is circularity in the world in the narrow sense. It is in the world in the broad sense because we talk about it, and our talking is in that broad world. But this was what nominalists like Occam and conceptualists like Abelard disagreed with realists like Aquinas about universals. They say, no, these are really our products. If we weren't talking and thinking about them, then they wouldn't be there. Carnap says, talk about triangularity looks like it's ground level material mode talk about what there is in the world, but it's really metalinguistic talk. It's talk about talk. To say triangularity is a property, that's a sentence that's true if and only if is triangular is a predicate, a one-place predicate, because it's a property. It's really metalinguistic talk. And so in a world in which there was no predicate is triangular, triangularity, it wouldn't be true that triangularity is a property. That triangularity is not in the world in the narrow sense. If talk about triangularity is really disguised talk about triangles, which was the Carnapian view. And I mean, Sellers adopted this view. He saw that that Carnap's view wouldn't do as it stood, because triangularity would still be a property if no one had ever spoken English. We could say Dreieckigkeit equally well. Well, which one is it if it's metalinguistic? Well, Sellers introduced his dot quotes to be a sortal kind term that applies both to is triangular and is dreieckig. Anything that plays the same role in our discourse is a dot, and then you put an instance of it, something that plays that role in your language, you put between dot quotes, and you get an expression that is true of all the things that play that role in some language. And there would still be dot is triangulars, even if there were no predicate is triangular, provided there was something playing that role in some language. So Sellers is going to paraphrase. He's going to adapt Carnap's definition by saying, well, what you're really saying when you say triangularity is a property is that dot is triangulars are monadic properties, are monadic predicates. That's really what you're saying. And if there were no discursive beings, there would not be any dot is triangulars, so they're not in the world in the narrow sense. And propositions are sort of dot sentences. So there aren't any of them in the world in the narrow sense either. So there aren't properties, there aren't relations, that is, there aren't Fregean concepts in the world in the narrow sense for Sellers. There aren't facts in it either. In the downstream from the Fregean dictum, a fact is a thought that is true. Well, in a non-discursive world, there aren't any thinkables for Sellers. That's a metalinguistic notion. There wouldn't be any of them. Frege doesn't have thoughts in the wirklich objective world either, because facts are thoughts that are true, and thoughts are the senses of sentences. They're third world denizens. They're a kind of sense. They're not in the wirklich world. But Sellers extrudes properties and relations and facts, propositions, true ones or false ones, from the world in the narrow sense. And this is something like his argument for nominalism, that the world consists of things, objects, not facts. Now, the issue for Frege, as I say, is not whether there's facts there. Facts are true thoughts. That's a kind of thought, a kind of sense. They're in the third world. But Frege allows in the actual objective world, the wirklich world, functions as well as objects, including the functions that are concepts. The concepts are properties and relations. They're not senses. They're in the wirklich world. So Frege is not a nominalist. Frege allows properties and relations as well as objects in his sort of most tightly constrained world, and Sellers doesn't. Now, if you think about the opening of the Tractatus, the world is everything that is the case. It's the sum of facts, not of things, not of objects. Wittgenstein says. That's a conceptually realist view in Frege's sense of concept, whereas Sellers, like Kant, is a conceptual phenomenalist. The concepts, even in Frege's sense, are ultimately metalinguistic products of our activity. What's in the world it's just one thing after another. It's these namables, not sayables. Sayables are not in the world in the narrow sense. Now, I actually wonder whether this nominalist ontology is so much as intelligible. But Sellers is committed to it, and in Sellers' late ontology, an ontology of processes, what moves him from sort of thing-like particulars, so he's a particular nominalist, things that can be referred to by singular terms. Particulars is maybe the most general term we could use. To use processes of which events are a limiting case as the particulars, rather than more sort of object-like things, whose paradigm is middle-sized bits of dry goods, because processes can include other processes, and he can get something predicate-like out of these inclusion relations, out of saying, well, there are things like the Second World War. That was a process. Now, I mean that only some correlates of that are in the world in the narrow sense, but there are a bunch of processes, and they stand in these. Well, I shouldn't say they stand in these relations, that they include each other spatiotemporally. Even that isn't right. They include each other, and he's going to get space and time out of those. I'm not principally aiming to talk about this late ontology. Is it a Meshuggah ontology? I don't know. It's the late one. But I'm interested in how Sellers, backed himself into this nominalist corner, let's say. And I've reproduced the argument as I understand it from the metalinguistic character of properties, relations, and facts. That's the basis for excluding them from the world in the narrow case, in the narrow sense. Which, as I say, I think it's a worthwhile ontological undertaking to try and say what's in the world in the narrow sense, to think counterfactually about sort of whole universes in which there are no discursive beings, and what we could say, what could still be true in them. So there's no abstracta in there. Yeah. Nikki.
I have a clarificatory question about this endeavor of imagining as well. It totally made the way we started asking what would have to be missing from this world in a narrow sense, given that it would be a product of discursive activity. That makes sense to me, but I imagine it would be illegal to talk about the world in a narrow sense in this way. I ask, what's in the world? It's illegal for that question to mean, is this thing a part of the whole of the world? Because that would be a relation. But I cannot imagine a sense to the question what's in the world if I'm not entitled to any such talk.
To any such part. So nominalists generally are okay with part whole.
Oh, okay.
With part whole relations, but the relation isn't, as it were, an extra item in the world. Yeah. But the items in the world can stand to one another in a way that licenses our part whole talk of them. Okay. So mereology, yes, for the nominalists and for Sellers, and so he's aiming to get everything that you could get by saying, and there are properties and relations and so on, just out of that.
So our license for item talk comes from somewhere else than our license for part whole talk.
Yeah.
Actually, that's Wittgenstein's point at the beginning of the tractate, right? Like the world is the totality of facts, not things. Why? Because there aren't things if there aren't facts. Things are a function of facts.
A feature of facts.
Feature, yeah.
Things must be true of
They
it.
come into view together,
Yes.
whatever it is we say.
Right, but there aren't truths in this world, and I mean, various people, but Rorty among them, have made fun of the notion of facts as sentence-shaped parts of the world, and Sellers is saying, yeah, they are essentially sentence-shaped parts of the world, and that's a metalinguistic notion. You're projecting your sentences into what's really there, narrowly there, when you talk about facts. Now, how that works, as I say, I'm not confident this is ultimately so much as intelligible, but he was committed to making it intelligible under the force of arguments like this. So I have two moves I would like to make. One of them is to go back to Frege and say, Frege distinguishes between sense and reference. I'll stop saying Bedeutung. You'll probably be glad that I stopped saying that. There's senses and there's their reference. Officially, the expression, the linguistic locution expresses a sense, and the sense designates a referent, a Bedeutung. That's Orthodox Phrygian. Now we say two vocabularies can stand to each other in a dependence relation, either on the side of reference or on the side of sense. So it could be that if the things referred to by the terms of vocabulary 1 didn't exist, then the things referred to by singular terms in vocabulary 2 couldn't exist. The Bedeutung of the one are dependent on the Bedeutungen of the other. If there were no parents, a world with no parents could have no children in it. That's a reference dependence relation between two vocabularies. And often when people talk about the supervenience of one vocabulary on another, you're starting with the reference dependence. If you think the aesthetic vocabulary supervenes on physicalistic vocabulary, you're saying, well, if the physical objects didn't exist, the beautiful objects couldn't exist. The supervenience claim is, if there isn't a physical difference between these, there can't be an aesthetic difference. That's a reference dependence claim, that the two physically indistinguishable objects could not be aesthetically distinguishable. But there's also sense dependence. If you didn't grasp the senses expressed by this vocabulary, you couldn't grasp the senses expressed by this other vocabulary. That's a kind of relation Sellers argues there is between is talk and looks talk. Unless you know what it is for something to be read, you can't understand what it is for it merely to look read or to seem read. Because, in effect, what you're saying when you say it merely looks read is, this is the kind of circumstance where if I didn't think there was any funny business going on, I would say it was read, but I'm worried that there's funny business going on, so I'm not going to say that, but I'm still expressing my temptation to call it read. Something like that is his analysis of merely looks, what you're saying when you say that it merely looks read. That's a sense dependence relation. And then here's the claim. There can be sense dependence without reference dependence. relations between vocabularies. So here's an example, response-dependent properties. So suppose we look at the property that some object has when looking at it would produce pleasure in a suitable subject. Now, I'm not going to suggest the aesthetic theory that says that's what beauty is. Let's regiment this use. Beauty star is a response-dependent property that something has just in case a suitable observer would be brought pleasure by looking at it, by visually seeing it. And now ask, were there any beautiful star sunsets before there were any suitable observers of them? And I take it the answer is yes, absolutely. It's a dispositional, subjunctive property that it would produce pleasure if there were such an observer. And even in a world where there actually isn't any such thing, if subjunctively it's true that if there were, looking on the sunset would cause them pleasure, then it is beautiful star. If that's right, and as I say, never mind about actual beauty, you can define a response-dependent property in terms of the dispositions that it has to affect other things. And things can have such response-dependent properties even in worlds where there aren't the things that whose responses you appeal to in defining them. The counterfactual could still be true. Well, in what sense are these response-dependent then? Well, it's that you can't understand what you're saying when you say that something is beautiful star unless you understand what pleasure and seeing and a suitable observer are. That's how we defined the term, and if you didn't grasp those concepts, so somebody has to know what a suitable observer is and what pleasure is and what seeing things is in order to understand beauty star defined in this response-dependent way. So there's a strict sense dependence of the talk about pleasure of suitable observers upon being in the visible presence of things. There's a strict sense dependence relation between that way of talking and talking about beautiful star, but it doesn't mean that there can't be beautiful star things in worlds in which none of these other concepts apply. Now this is, I think, a crucial distinction if you're thinking about the mind dependence of the world. There are all kinds of things that are sense dependent on our activities. So I would claim you don't understand what a fact is unless you can understand what a declarative sentence is. And you don't understand that unless you understand what asserting is, what judging, believing is. Does that mean that there can't be any facts in a world in which there aren't any asserters? Well, no, I don't think it does mean that. You can't understand what you're saying about this world, that it consists of these facts, without drawing on your understanding of what it would be to state those facts. But it doesn't mean that we can't make sense of a world in which it would be true to say that, even though there's nobody there to say it. I would say you can't understand what a particular is unless you understand what it is to use something as a singular term. That's sort of the view of the Grundlagen. Similarly, for properties and relations and concept expressions, I think you can't understand what a law of nature is unless you understand subjunctively robust conditionals. But that doesn't mean that Newton's law of gravity wasn't a law before anybody was in a position to utter subjunctive conditionals. So I take it that there's a whole set of ontological categorical concepts about the objective world, that it consists of facts about the properties and relations of objects or particulars and law-like connections among all of those. You can't talk about a world that has objects and their properties and relations and those facts and the laws relating them. That's all sense-dependent on our talk about what you're doing in talking, about the use of these expressions and the contents of these expressions. But it's a sense dependence, not a reference dependence of them. It's as intelligible to say that the objective world, the world in the narrow sense, has all these things in it, objects and their properties and relations and their law-like connections, that can be true of a world in which there are no language users, even though what you're saying about that world is unintelligible except by reference to the possibility of there being talkers like this. So I think Frege has given us an absolutely crucial conceptual tool here for thinking about this, at any rate, modern, pervasively modern question about the mind dependence of the world. And insofar as that's right, or at any rate following this line of thought out, we ought to ask Sellers whether the sense in which talk of universals, of properties, of facts, and so on, is metalinguistic. Whether that sense underwrites a reference dependence claim or only a sense dependence claim. He says, what you're doing when you say triangularity is a property is classifying dot is triangulars as one-place predicates. That's what you're doing. What you say is true, what you're saying is true, is intelligible as linguistic expressions playing this sort of role are monadic predicates. But isn't that more like the response dependence case, where so you can only understand what somebody's saying when they say triangularity is a property by thinking about the use of predicates? That's true. Just as you can only understand what they're saying when they say that's a fact, in a context in which you understand what it is to state facts, to say things, to say that things are thus and so, pragmatically and semantically. But it doesn't follow from that there's a reference dependence relation, that it's only in a possible world, that is a possible universe in which there actually are discursive beings, that it's intelligible that there are facts, properties, and so on. So the thought I want to leave you with is that this argument that Sellers felt compelled by, driven to a really radical nominalist ontology, what is there for science to tell us about the world in the narrow sense, for natural science to tell us about that it's got to be just a bunch of particulars, maybe some of which are parts of others, because of the metalinguistic analysis of abstract objects, talk, that all these Fregean semantic concepts are formed by abstraction, introduced by abstraction. They're semantic because they involve substitution to get the equivalence relation that is the abstractor, and it's intersubstitution saving a semantogenic property, the truth of a claim or the goodness of an implication. So that's the subset of abstract object talk that is semantic talk. But all of it is metalinguistic in that you're looking at substitution relations of expressions in order to define functions and so on. It is all metalinguistic, but it doesn't follow that only in a world in which people were talking, so there were languages to be meta about, could there be these things. That's a reference dependence claim, and it at any rate doesn't follow from the sense dependence claim. That's what the example of response-dependent concepts is supposed to show, that at least you need to do some more work after you've shown a sense dependence claim in order to show a reference dependence claim. So, I mean, this might be a sort of fanciful excuse that I had for telling this story. Frege's three-partite ontology. Well, Sellers has his two-part ontology that is cutting at different joints than the Fregean one, and it has this Frege's student Carnap introduces this metalinguistic notion that Sellers sees driving him to a nominalism, but thus sense reference distinction, if we think about sense dependence and reference dependence, gives us a way of talking about unobjectionable mind dependence. Sense to say the world is mind dependent in a sense dependence way is not a crazy or extreme sort of idealism. If you take the step then to say, well, but there's a reference dependence too. What's the tag of God intoxicated Berkeley, who proved all things a dream, that this great farrowing pig of a world that doth so solid seem would vanish in an instant if the mind but change its theme. That sort of idealism that says unless there are thinkers, there can't be, this kind of stuff and this kind of stuff and this kind of stuff. Sense dependence, okay. If you want to make the stronger reference dependence claim, that's going to require more. So anyway, I thought this was a sufficiently useful application of the Fregean conceptual machinery that I was willing to seize this relatively thin narrative excuse for telling it. But I commend to your attention the notions of sense dependence and reference dependence, which Frege did not apply. He didn't use his notion for that. And I regret that I didn't think of it till Sellers was gone, so I could never say this to him either. Okay, the course was Frege in context, and when I set out to do that, I thought, well, I'm going to have to talk about Kant. You have to talk about Kant. That's Kant to Frege, yes, we do. And I had the, at least L'Ignape of Bolzano in there. But I've been pretty good about not looking at later stuff, but every once in a while needed to do that, and this is the last one of those. So, way more stuff about Frege, but hope these have been good stories.